Yes, I am. I'm going to be talking about optimizing yeast propagation systems for brewery success. This is more of a case study that we did with a brewery in Denver, and so we're going to have sort of give you guys information on that and then how you can do that with your own brewery. So about me, I'm Brittany. I am the lab and quality manager for Propagate Lab in Golden, Colorado. Prior to this, I was a head brewer in Denver for 4 years, and during that time, I got a GABF and World Cup medal, so I know a little bit about brewing. And since then, I've learned a lot about yeast. So why should you care? So fresh yeast pitches can cost up to 33% of a beer's cost, which is a lot of money, especially if you're going to be brewing a lot. You can lower the amount of money you're spending on yeast, and instead you can buy like nice hops, newer equipment, maybe give yourself a little bit of a raise, all that good stuff. The word for a person who takes care of yeast is called a Hefner, which is what that is. You can Google it. It will not give you its definition. It will give you some more interesting and fun results. So, for yeast harvesting, one of the best ways to save money is to obviously repitch it, which brewers have been doing for ages. That first photo up there in those cube fermenters, open fermenters, it's a picture from Sierra Nevada, where they are brewing Bigfoot barley wine. You can see the outraged Krausen on the open Toxberg fermenters. That is mostly yeast and could be harvested for another batch of beer. This can be done by cropping off the top of the tanks. There are a ton of major breweries that do that. Magic Hat, for example, is one. The yeast in the Krausen is generally low in trub, incredibly healthy and active. And the best time to top crop is when you've been fermented through 50% of your sugars in your beer. Most recently, Beer Journalist did an MBA podcast where they do this, which is no surprise because English breweries have been doing this for a really long time. They are able to do this with their New England IPAs by blowing yeast out of the top port of their fermenters into blow-off arm into sterile kegs, and then they use that to repitch their yeast into their next batches. So this is just yeast propagation, beginning to end. This is a slide right off of White Lab's website, actually. That's why they are their yeast pitches. The owner of Propagate, Matthew, who was supposed to be here and is not. So he worked at BSI. He knows the owner of Imperial, and who also used to work at Y Yeast. So he can assure that everyone everywhere for yeast propagation does the same exact thing. And there's no crazy piece of technology or secret voodoo that goes into this, so you as brewers can also do this. So what we do is we take negative PZ freezer. We have little 2 ml vials of strains that we keep on hand. You streak it out so that 2 ml strain can last for ages. Streak it out onto a plate. Once you get your isolated colonies, you then grow that in sterile wort in a flask, like you do on a homebrew scale, and then you just prop up from there. So once you go through your liquid cultures, you go into your yeast prop vessel. At Propagate, we have 8 10 barrels, and then a 7 and an 8 barrel as well for lower flocculating strains. After that, we crash it like you normally do with a beer. We harvest the yeast from the bottom, and then that's when we ship it out to breweries. Packaging comes in a bunch of different forms. I'll have videos later to show you how we harvest yeast and then how you can do that yourself. You can skip the initial steps of like having a negative AD freezer, having to plate, growing up liquid cultures just by purchasing a small yeast pitch from your yeast provider and then growing your pitches up from there. So you by adding to the fermenter with about 1/10 of the volume being pitched. So if you're you need to pitch 1 barrel into a 10 barrel tank, 1.5 barrels of yeast into a 50 barrel tank. This is what Great Divide did, and then we'll show you how they did it.
Hi.
Good.
Sorry,
Before I go to Great Divide real quick, I just want to talk about what I did at Fiction as a brewer. I use a ton of dry yeast. When we go into this, when we talk about yeast prop vessels, I also brew homebrew pitches from like the homebrew shop in a 15-gallon brink, yeast brink, using a fish aerator and a HEPA filter. And that's all you needed to do. And I was on a 7-barrel system and pitching that into 14 and 21-barrel fermenters. It is incredibly easy. It's simple to do. On a production kind of scale, though, for Great Divide, they do 150 barrels. And so they were doing cone-to-cone repitches. They were doing lots of bio-dry hops. And so they were ordering lots and lots of fresh pitches. In 2021, their total expense was $117,000, almost $118,000 just in yeast alone. So I'm going to try to read some of Isabel's notes just so you guys know, because she is not here and she is the QA manager for Great Divide. So they wanted to increase profit margins by moving to dry hopping and then harvesting yeast prior to that, and then repitching by changing their recipes. So with that, she decided to implement a prop system into their program. By doing that, they allowed flexibility with recipes, convenience for lab quality. She is the only lab person in their production facility, without needing to hire more people, and they needed a program that kind of fits seamlessly into what they were doing, without extra work from her or needing to hire on extra folks. So they started to do that in February 22, so about 2 years ago, and then they asked us to get involved, and so we actually helped them create their prop system for their brewery. And then materials and tanks were installed, and then their first yeast in-house propagation happens. So some adversity along the way. There was a bunch of resistance from management because of labor costs and upfront costs and everything like that. Something that they learned along the way is that you need sterile air filtration. You can use an oxygen tank if you are using a pump to constantly recirculate your tank to get the proper mixture while propagating. What she learned was that that was not the way to do it. Her advice is strictly do not use oxygen tanks. Oxygen tanks are expensive. 9 liters per minute is not enough to create that mixture in the tank to get proper propagation. You don't have a continuous flow, and also tanks would run out in the middle of the night, so then they no longer had any oxygen running through their tanks. Along that, they also had continuous micro fails, and so along the way, they found different ways to alleviate that. They had to learn like proper sanitizing dosing. Yeast is different from beer because we're not putting hops into the yeast. We're trying to keep the product as pure as possible, so we don't have any sort of antimicrobial way. So you have to be really, really tight in your sanitation. One cell of bacteria can contaminate an entire tank of yeast. We see that kind of often, and it's really sad to dump 200-barrel pitchable yeast down the drain. And we're doing 8 tanks a week at our lab. Let's see, so some other micro fails were happening because sample ports were not properly CIP'd, and then carb stones as well. So this goes, Isabel now is the only one, they have 2 prop vessels. This is one of them. This is when they first started, so this is their prop vessel overflowing with yeast. When the tanks get broken down at the end, after harvesting it, she takes all of the sample ports and carb stones, she makes sure that they're clean, and then she autoclaves them. Since then, they haven't had any micro fails throughout the propagation process. Another thing that she learned was on her LCSN, so the sulfate, which inhibits brewer's yeast but allows for wild yeast to grow. She was getting false positives on that, where Saccharomyces was growing on it, and it's because the sample that she was putting onto her plates was very robust and healthy, so there wasn't enough of an inhibitory factor of the plate to make that work. So she did that by just making a higher dosage rate of that LCSM plates. And the reason she found out that those were Saccharomyces growing on the plates is because she would bring them to me, where I would PCR them for her to let her know that the yeast was actually safe to pitch. Let's see, volume loss with certain strains. The London 3, it takes a little bit longer for it to flocculate, and so they lose a little bit there, and then storing a multitude of harvesting different vessels, which I'll go into, but they used 7-gallon clear jugs for visuals and such. Okay, cool. So this presentation is from November, but their total pitch expense was $27,000. That was like that doesn't include inputs and labor costs, but 2 years before that, there's $118,000. So we saved an incredible amount. Sure. Okay, so I'm going to go into the tank, into the harvesting real quick. So that's like the jugs. But if you purchase yeast from us or any yeast supplier, you may have seen, the clear jugs that you get your stuff in. So they harvesting into these containers rather than a yeast spring is a lot more helpful because yeast springs, you don't have a visual. They also obtain a lot of head pressure in them. And there's no real sanitary way to kind of vent that pressure. Just because once you open the valve on the top of that brink, you can get yeast flowing out, and then you now have a contaminated quart. But with these, even at the lab, and with talking with Isabel, you can see when those jugs expand, and you can just easily vent the lid. So she goes in every other day or once a week, depending on how often she's growing yeast for the brewery. And we'll just go through and kind of just prevent those jugs. And in those smaller cases, it's easier because you can see that there's not a whole ton of volume buildup. And so they use 5 different yeast strains. So I'm going to go back because my notes are in the wrong part. They use, sorry.
Yes, screaming gets me every time.
Yeah. They use, I know they use Chico, London 3, Carlsberg, and I can't remember the other two. I'm sorry. But the thing is that those prop tanks aren't set to one strain. They use the strain, they use the tank to grow this strain, and then they clean it, flip it, and then grow a new strain into it.
How do they get their wort? Is it from sterile extract, or are they just side streaming off the brew house?
They're side streaming off their brew house. Yeah, nice. So that's part of their bringing it into their system to make it kind of like a plug and play, essentially. Is she doesn't have to go and mix like a side barrel of sterile wort. They're just pulling it off their production facility into those tanks. So after she started autoclaving the carb stones and the sample quarts, and now Isabel is the only one to pitch yeast as well, they have not had a failed crop in 5 months. And then there's also like a physical examination of all the CIP parts from QA. Okay, cool. I'm sorry. I took all these notes this morning because Isabel was supposed to be here and she did not come from Denver with me, so.
I'm just laughing at the guy screaming.
Sorry. So this is like how her week goes. So Monday she'll do micro clears. Yeast is harvested and tanks are clayed. So it grows over the week. So harvest can take multiple days, like I said, 1 to 3, couple days. They harvest into reusable 7-gallon plastic jugs that they purchased from Uline. And then they also have 2.5-gallon and 1-gallon jugs from us that was also purchased from Uline. You really just need to sanitize the inside of those because there's no like aggravation. You don't have to worry about scratches or anything like that. Any sort of contamination with jugs you can reuse and upcycle.
Pretty much just fill in the PAA.
Yeah. Yeah. I know at Great Divide, they clean every jug with caustic. Sometimes they'll throw some acid in it, and then just throw sanitizer in it. Yeah. So PAA, we use Star Sand at the lab, and to make sure, just because it foams and we know it touches every portion of the jug. And so you can constantly reuse these jugs until you deem them unworthy. And then she counts, labels, and stores yeast. So date and all that kind of stuff. Know what strain, where the yeast is coming from. Because if they don't produce a 3-barrel pitchable from us, she'll just harvest yeast off of beers that they could be brewed. And then also with that 3-barrel fresh pitch they get from us, they pitch it into 7 barrels of wort that's a 7-barrel tank. And let's see, sorry to just misinformation, literally when you guys are walking in. Okay, so it's actually a 7-barrel vessel, 6 barrels of wort. So then they get 3 barrels from us, and then within that 6 barrels of wort, they grow it into a 150-barrel pitchable at 11 Plato. Cool. And then, so on Tuesday, wort is added to feed the starter pitches, which are the pitches they get from us. Nutrient yeast pitches, continuous oxygen, and then sterile samples are collected 3 times throughout the process, which is what creates her microclears on Monday. The first sample is collected from the HEX to the yeast prop vessel, from whatever beer they're pulling off of on the side. And then gravity is monitored, tank temp is dropped towards the end of fermentation. So it takes about 48 hours to get a full prop to grow. And so after about 24 hours, Isabel will drop the tank about 3 Celsius without having to down dial any of the oxygen moving to the tank. That way, if propagation finishes overnight, she doesn't have to worry about starving the yeast and or decreasing viability because of that starvation of the air. So she's just slowing down the growth process for those last 24 hours. Cool, yes.
What is the scalability of percent of increase for pitch rates based on stepping it up?
Do I have a slide for that later?
Okay.
And so, yeah, so gravity is monitored, and then when tanks are crashed, she takes an additional sample there. That's her second sample. And then they get plated Thursday, Friday, Monday, those plates get read back. And then if all 3 of those samples that have taken have passed on wild yeast and bacteria, then that yeast is pitched, and then everything starts all over again. With this system that they put into place, Isabel can just work her normal job without having to input extra hours. Like I said, they did it basically to make it easier for the lab and for the brew house without having to increase labor costs or anything like that. The upfront costs, obviously, you kind of have to cover. So the pop vessels, they added, and then they added a sterile filter, air filter into it. So this is the break-even costs for Great Divide. So 2 7-barrel tanks, sterile air filter. You just need an air compressor, and it's the sterilization that is really important. You can just use regular compressed air prior to that. And so you can see there their costs per run. So about $815 for a 150 barrel pitchable, which would probably be closer to, a lot, it's a lot. And so savings, 120 barrels of yeast, $3,000. So it took them about 3 months, she said, being on the more cautious side. After 3 months, they broke even on everything that they installed to create their prop system. And their potential savings per year, $187,000. Yeah, and then it allows, like I said, it allows them flexibility to brew what they need to brew, and then they can also pull yeast off for their smaller R&D kind of one-off strains. So the best wort to prop with, low alcohol, IBU, and color. Some strains just suck. They just do. I'm not gonna lie. In particular, saison strains and lager strains. From my personal experience, they kind of just suck, mainly because they don't flock very well. And trying to get the correct pitch bowl from that is kind of sucky. I'm just gonna say suck again.
What's up with that? Because like, so whenever I drop yeast off the bottom of the water tank, right, and you've been told your entire life, right, but they ferment at the bottom. Why is there so little yeast?
It flocks so slowly, so that's why like you get like horizontals for lager tanks, so it's less volume for it to fall through. I don't know. They just take a long time. You can, as a brewer, if you're going to do that, you can choose selectively for the yeast that does flock out sooner to help that. And so, if you do decide to do that as a brewer, I would suggest in getting like, you know, the nice little creamy middle of the yeast so true, and then the good stuff and the lower flocculating. Try to choose something in between there. Then you can, if you do like repitch that yeast, again, you can always just keep being selective about that strain, and then you can eventually make it into like a goodbye strain that drops like that, if that's what you're looking for. But also lager yeast, you kind of want in solution anyway to clean up all that sulfur and stuff. But yeah, some strains just suck. They just don't want to. They're just like, they like hanging out in the beer, and so they just take their time kind of making their way down unless you're using some sort of random agent. Which we don't, because obviously we're trying to give you guys just the yeast itself.
On the ale side, like coating is the same thing. It's like,
Yeah.
we just can't get it to go anywhere. Like,
Yeah, no, it kind of just hangs
Sometimes
out.
it's strain dependent. Some yeast are chain forming, so literally the yeast below it will produce a CO2 level that will hold up the other
They'll
chain.
push everything along.
And so that's why they float to the top. Lager strains are not chain forming, individual.
Just do their own thing.
No CO2 blowing.
And then within 24 hours of a cold crash, ideal to harvest your yeast then. It's actually true with a high variability loss after 24 hours. So Isabel also witnessed this. I've witnessed this when I was a brewer before. Like I said, in yeast springs, if you have yeast springs, a fermenter, any vessel sitting with 15 pounds of pressure loses about 50% viability every 24 hours. So not being able to see whether your yeast spring has any pressure in it, kind of detrimental. You don't actually know the viability, so unless you have a microscope and you can count that, you're never really sure. So, yeah, cool. Gravity and gravity effect on these types. There's general information in charts, so the higher the gravity, as well as the IBUs, the less viable like the yeast tends to be. You can take yeast for like a higher IBU and gravity and color to a lighter or less than in all of those things, but you will bring some color into your lighter beer, and then also you bring in some bitterness if you go from like a hoppier beer to a less hoppy beer. So when going to like do a yeast prop for yourself, it's nice to just know that you don't have to worry about those effects. Is this what your question was, Bill?
Maybe.
Okay, here's the question. I don't know. So how much yeast do you need to grow? So prop size, This is like a variance at least that we have kind of seen. So like the lower flocculating strains, I would even say we probably get, so in our 10-barrel fermenters, that we prop them in, we get around like 100-barrel pitchables of yeast, and then like provide strains that crash super hard, you can get 200-barrel pitchable out of the 10-barrel tank. Yeah, and then it's also highly dependent on nutrients and oxygen. So you need some like calcium chloride and urea will help with that as well. If you're just throwing oxygen into there, that's great and all, but you need some nutrients just like you do during fermentation. That's what you need during propagation. So a small growth strategy, you can buy a small prop vessel. Like this is a 1-barrel SF brew tank you can purchase. And then the cost for 1-barrel pitch of yeast, depending on your provider, can go from $37 to $109, $30 of boards, and your nutrients. So the total cost to yourself for each prop can range between $115 to $185 after you've paid off like the prop vessel. Whereas if you get a fresh pitch from any of the providers across the country, this is for a 10-barrel pitch, between 300 and 1,000 barrels, or $1,000. Got those mixed up, for a fresh pitch. So large growth strategy. So this is our lab. And so dedicated prop tank, which is what Great Divide also did. So you want to fill it with wort, add your nutrients, pitch yeast at a beginning barrel size for whatever you're looking for, and then aerate. So the cost is wort at barrel size, nutrients, and then pitchable. And so we use ink birds to help control the glycol system into our tanks, and then instead of a racking arm, there's actually a carved stone that runs right through where the racking arm goes to help oxygenate and mix up that whole tank.
How often are you aerating?
So we aerate for 48 hours. So we are moving off of a, we don't have a brew house at the lab, we're actually using a pick heater. So we're using LME and sugar and nutrients, and then we're putting it through a steam pick heater, which immediately takes the media from 120 Fahrenheit to 220, and then we're putting that into the tank, so that's how we sterilize it. And as soon as we get that filled, also there's ozonated water that's in it, that's how we get the correct dilution. That we run it for 48 hours. So we'll take beginning gravity, it'll start to move overnight, and then when you come in 48 hours later, so if we start it on Monday, we'll come in Wednesday morning, and it'll be finished.
So you talked about not using oxygen tanks earlier. Is that running off of like a bulk oxygen tank, or like how is that?
So this is really hard to see because I did not make this presentation and all these pictures are sideways, but everyone turn your head to the right. So this is just a normal air compressor. It's like normal big air compressor. And then once it comes off the air compressor, what's not pictured is that we have a dehydrator. And then it goes through those 3 filters there, and then into a sterile filter, which every other month I'll take and we will autoclave. And then through that sterile filter, it runs through PEX lines, and then into the carb stone.
So is that like a refrigerated air dryer that you use for like your canning line and
Yes.
stuff like that?
Yeah, exactly.
How long does that sterile filter last you?
That one?
Yeah.
So I change it out every 6 months, like the actual filter within it. And we've changed our system since then, and we're slowly moving to being automated. But we have had like backflow into it, where then we have to change out like the paper filters within, and then it gets autoclaved. But normally we don't take that off at all, unless absolutely necessary.
Do you have any manual agitation of the yeast brink, or do you just use the aeration?
Just the aeration. So the air goes in there pretty quickly. Like you can hear it and like feel it come through the carb stone. I couldn't give you like an exact PSI since we don't have it on every single tank. We just have one source.
What volume of flow?
set to like, coming out of the compressor is like 50 pounds, and then that's split between 8 tanks. And then on those carb stones, we have valves prior to the carb stone that allows how much flow, so we can adjust that if needed. Because some carb stones are worse for wear than others because they're older and we just don't get very good flow. And so those we kind of just open all the way, and others that we like slowly get in there and you can just crack that airflow. And so you kind of just determine how quickly it's propagating through taking gravity measurements.
So those are obviously stock FVs that you're cropping in.
Yes.
If you could have mechanical agitation, do you think that would be helpful, or would the mixing of the air at a high rate would make much difference, do you think?
I don't think it would make much difference. I mean, I haven't used anything to use like a manual agitation, but the air that runs through these tanks is very vigorous. And so, I mean, you could feel it when you're holding like the carb stone going into the tank. You can feel it, and then you can like hear it going through.
And I will say, I've pitched a lot of their yeast. Just testing cell counts, I've had very, very high cell counts based on doing a little analytical research in-house. They have very good pitchable cells all the same.
And then so for harvesting, I actually have a video on the next one, but these are just some of the things that we do. So like sample, that's just Bob's actually cleaning a tank, and then I'm like running the PCR in that last one. So this is bring to a second container. Let me see. Okay, it has to be this one. One of these is a video. I don't know how to make it work. No. How do I like use text? No. Okay, I'll figure it out. But so this is just we're just using 90-degree elbows. That's a barbed tri-clamp fitting that we use for like a hose, and then just like a 12-inch kind of stainless steel spool. So that's our harvesting manifold. And what we do is we fill those jugs with star sand or pH, whatever you want to use. Give it a good shake, dump that out, and then that barb fitting fits right into that 2.5-gallon jug pretty perfectly. And then you just open your valve at the bottom of your tank very slowly, so that you know that you're getting yeast running down the cone instead of pulling air right through the middle. And then you can get like a visual through your sight glass, whether it's like the consistency that you're looking for, and as it's going into the jug, since it's clear, what kind of consistency, if it's like too thin, if you want to even use it. And then we usually let the yeast settle for like 24 hours to determine like how much, based off a visual, what that kind of cell count is. And then within your own brewery, you can do that same thing where you get used to it. So talking with Isabel, in that 7.5-gallon container, depending on the volume, she knows exactly kind of how much she's looking for by eyeballing it for a 6-barrel, or if we're just doing 50 versus their 150. I'm really sorry, I don't know how to make that video work. And then, yes.
Before that harvesting, like after 48 hours, are you cold crashing?
Yes. Yes. So, thank you. Yes. So we are cold crashing the tank for another 24 hours, and we don't harvest until the next day, unless it is a really hard flocculating strain, like a Scottish ale strain or a Quebec. Those we can harvest a day of. Because if we let that sit for too long under head pressure, and then we only put like 5 pounds of head pressure on the tank. So we're not stressing out the yeast the whole time while it's flocculating out so we can harvest it. And then we harvest our yeast over a period of 3 days to make sure that we're getting everything out of the tank that we can. Some QC methods, so you can get a microscope for like $200 and then do your own cell counts and viability with methylene blue. Back behind behind Matthew is a ceilometer, so it's actually a cell counter. From my experience, it is a random number generator. So a $200 microscope, way more beneficial than a $10,000 cell counter. I'll like test the same thing, it'll give me completely two different numbers. So I wouldn't use that. Ezekiel here, he is pouring plates, so we use WLD and LCSM, which you can make in-house. That's just to detect for bacteria and wild yeast strains. And if you don't have plate accessibility, just trust in your process. Find someone who does, make friends, find a lab, and like we have some brewers get plates from us. And then every single tank that we grow in the lab, I go through and PCR everything. So we've been doing that for the last 2.5 years. Prior to that, we were going strictly off plates, which is great, but having the PCR is a really nice thing as well. So then, you know, for sure what you're getting. Roll this play. I don't know what I'm doing now. I know, but it's changed. It's not, I'm not in that screen anymore. It's like this. So I don't know where that went. Here. I know how to use a laptop, I swear. This is the worst laptop in all the world. Okay, cool. Anyway, that's just a PCR. It's a PCR wave. So you'll just see it grow. If I could maybe make this work, this is absolutely horrifying.
Yeah.
But I don't know why I can't get.
Can you get a cursor onto that?
Oh.
There you
Ah. Technology, so cool. So this is just a PCR that runs, and it takes about 47 minutes to run this after I do a 20-minute digest on it. So about 3 hours to run a PCR. And then you can see all these really fun curves, whether you, in hopes that you want them. The core 4, like, this is a Midwest microbiome. What it tracks, the core 4 that we do is Saxter VCA, we do a Brett all primer to make sure you're not getting any Brett, any sort of hop-resistant bacteria, and then diastaticus. And then all of those like really late formers, those are just like not overpitching, overload of cells. There's like way too many yeast, and so then it kind of freaks out a little bit. Cool, and so this is how we used to store our yeast. You may have gotten your yeast now or like this previously from your yeast provider. Also, again, clear, these are soft-sided, and so they get punctured in transport and or explode if they got too much pressure. And so not ideal, which is why we move to those hard containers. But again, with a clear vessel like this, you can just degas as you need, and you can keep your yeast for like ideally 2 weeks for viability. Also, if you're going to keep it longer than that, just be sure to feed it a little bit to make sure that viability stays up. Just feed it some sterile wort off of a tank or anything that you've grown. And then as cold as possible without freezing, so you don't kill those cells. Our coolers at the lab sit at between 34 and 38 degrees. And I know coolers at breweries are typically 38.
Would you need to feed it during storage? Would you add any nutrients to the sterile water?
You don't need to, because ideally you'd be using it.
Just to maintain it?
Yeah, just to maintain it. Unless you're trying to grow it and propagate it, then it would like need that nutrient to use that energy to create more. Low pressure before use, and then toss after 4 weeks. daily.
For that feeding, say you knew you wanted to use pitch after 3 weeks, when exactly would you feed that? Like, would it be a day before or a week before?
I would feed it in between that just to maintain the health of it, like
So like
around
10
2
days,
weeks.
then?
Yeah, 10 days, 2 weeks. And then again, you would want to feed it like the day that you're brewing, just to make sure it's active prior to pitching it.
And then, do you have any recommendation on like what volume of work?
That's a good question. I will get back to you. I'm not positive because we use 60 Play-Doh concentrated in 50 ml tubes, which is what we send brewers so that the yeast gets started the day of. That's a good question. I'll get back to you. I also don't know what I'm looking at anymore. It's just no longer on my screen. Okay. Cool. So summary, this is our lab, and this is sometimes, it happens, and it's very sad. Just like Great Divide had those issues. I think we had the air went a little bit crazy. We had a real cool party when we weren't there. So in summary, repitching yeast and propagating yeast, you could totally do it. Obviously, I went through a Great Divide, the production brewery scale, but it is super easy. Like I said, if you have a yeast brink and a fish aerator, which you can get at Walmart, and a HEPA filter from a brew shop, and some hose, you can do it yourself. I have done it without agitating the yeast brink and without having a carb zone. Obviously, there's agitation. And so it may not be the best to say whether, like on a yeast brink, if you have agitation, you probably get more yeast, but I was brewing hazy IPAs, so I was under pitching anyhow, so I wasn't looking to get a whole ton of growth from that. And yeah, you can do some simple QC. You can buy plate medium plates like from Weber Scientific, and then just do it in lab. You can buy a really cheap incubator from Amazon to keep a couple plates in, and it's a 2-day turnaround if you do end up doing that. So make sure you give yourself time in planning if you're going to be repitching yeast. And then just be consistent in everything you do. So every time you break down a tank, everything gets cleaned just like at Great Divide. We autoclave also all of our carb zones, make sure they're properly cleaned so that nothing gets into the tank. We've had tanks fail because somehow one cell of bacteria got into it and we have plaque growth, and we're not as send that to you guys to prop for yourselves, and so, yeah, and then have a backup plan in case the pitch doesn't work. That's it. And then these are some iPads. There's the one on there with bearded iris and how they prop from their yeast, and then yeast washing, which I didn't really cover, but you can also wash yeast with deoxychlorine killing sort of bacteria, storing yeast as well. Yeah.
So, one of those things that just like stuck in my head was like, you were talking about harvesting off the big football, right? How they
Yeah.
could ostensibly do it. One of those things that I've been told since I was a little Mike brewer was like, don't harvest off of anything for 15 days.
Yeah. Yes, but they're harvesting off of high crowson, so it hasn't gotten to that alcohol content, and it's right when it's like incredibly active, super, super healthy, so it hasn't been put in under any of those stressors yet. Yeah. Hasn't been under pressure, alcohol, hops, any other sort of biomaterial. Yeah.
That sounds crazy.
Does rinsing yeast increase the shelf life of it past those 4 weeks?
You have to keep feeding it. But yeah, I mean, it does help in the case where by rinsing the yeast that you are cleaning it of any sort of undesirables like bacteria and wild yeast strains. You can even do that. You do ideally want to feed it during that time though. So you can, but hopefully you're using your yeast quickly enough in your brewing process that you have like 2 or 3 in-house strains that you're consistently using, that you're not having to keep yeast for long. No, they're just putting them into sterile vessels for repeating. Yeah.
I'm curious about crop and crop. Anybody does that? I didn't know if there was any sort of studies on it,
Ooh, I'm not sure.
just to try to, I guess, continue the generation or continue it longer.
Yeah.
It's kind of an imprecise question, but, so I have a vessel actually has an agitated later than one of those things, so I'm thinking it would make a nice prop vessel. But the one thing I've been trying to wrap my head around is there a calculation I should be using to like before I prop up a pitch and make enough for the beer that I want it to go to, or do I just make a bunch and then cell count it and use that to determine how much volume I need for beer?
This is gonna sound so ridiculous, because I don't yeast. But when I was brewing, I just used Brewer's Friend.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so just do that, because then you don't, I mean, you could do like a sub count and then
Oh, yeah.
split off kind of what you're looking for, but I would, if you just start with like, I mean, if you're already, are you saying like you're doing it from like a known cell count? Or you, or
No, I
taking it
guess
from
my
something
question
you
is
have
like,
from
I
a
just,
tank?
like prop up a bunch of yeast and figure out how much of that I
He wants an exact yield.
Oh, yeah, you could do that too.
need. You can do it either way.
Either way, yeah. So like you could have,
From what I found out, I ended up just finding an equation based on how many pounds per pitch
Yeah.
per batch. And that ended up being like the basis for each beer. But it's personal to your cell count and how much you're gonna pitch for
Right.
your beer.
yeah, but if you're gonna use like that yeast for multiple beers during the week and you just wanted to throw a lot of it,
I would prefer to, at least where I'm at right now, I just grow enough.
for that pitch, okay, yeah. Yes.
Have you seen any benefits while propagating yeast to use zinc heptahydrate?
Ooh, no, I have not, we don't use, I mean, we use like some trace minerals. It's like, when I say trace minerals, it's like the smallest amount of like, magnesium sulfate and, other stuff, but it's mainly just nutrient. I can't think off the top of my head.
I've done it a couple times and I found it like flocks out a lot faster, even lager strains, but it's never been controlled. That's why I was wondering if you ever did anything on that.
Oh, for using zinc, yeah, we use calcium chloride to help kind of with that flocculation, but also during propagation. But it doesn't add like a whole ton, like still with lager strains and saisons, it's still really slow to draw out. Well, that is the end of my presentation.